Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here on this fine Monday morning. My name's Colin Chapman, and you are here with one of our digital formation webinars where this afternoon we're going to be talking about Skype and spiritual direction. We're really excited about what we have today. We're excited about who we have today and what's going on. If you've been here before, you know some of the format, but if not, we welcome you. We have a lot of new people joining us, a lot of spiritual directors, a lot of people interested in spiritual direction. So thank you for taking the time to come join us. Uh, Real briefly, just to let you know what we have going on here, this is Digital Formation. We are a program associated with the General Theological Seminary here in New York, New York. We focus on social media and new media, thinking about it in new ways, but rooting everything we do in a theological framework, trying to get out of the mindset that social media is just about growing churches, but can be used in new and engaging and formative ways. We talk to lay people and clergy alike, and I think never more than today. I think we have a lot of great lay people on the line. Um, it's a seminary program, but we really reach out to everyone here, and we offer things like this webinar, guest speakers on campus, training, and on-demand content. If you're not already following us on Facebook, go to facebook.com/digitalformation and follow us there. Or you can also follow us on Twitter at digiformation. But today we're really excited because we're kind of co-hosting this with another organization on campus, the Center for Christian Spirituality, which offers courses and certificates in spiritual direction. They have a great certificate program on in spiritual direction to children, ascetical theology, and you can find out more about them at gts.edu/center-for-christian-spirituality. We'll link to them on our Facebook page after the show. So one thing that we talk about here in Digital Formation, we preface all of our meetings with these three things we'd like you to consider. One, come along for the ride. You've already come this far, so if you can, just take a take a sample of what we're talking about here. Every now and then we might talk about something a little new, a little different, something you may not be used to. Today we're talking about something completely new and different. You know, using audio, video, internet technology in spiritual direction, something that's often a very close, personal, in-person, intimate experience. So, but come along for the ride, see how it fits, see how you like it, and when it's all over, if you think it was a load of hogwash, you could throw it out. But I think for the next hour, keep an open mind and see what we have in store. But know that everything we're talking about is about relationship. So spiritual direction is profoundly about relationship, the relationship between the director and the directee, relationship between the director, the directee, and God present in the room. And I think we'll talk about more today how that's still very true and what's going on. And but also what we're talking about is a la carte. You don't need to take everything you hear. If you like something you hear, take that away. If you like it all, you can take that too. Um, but so without further ado, our topics today, we're going to be talking about Skype and spiritual direction with our special guest, Lindsay Boyer, who's on the line. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Colin.
How are you
Thanks
doing?
so much for inviting me.
We are really thrilled to have you. Um, yeah, Lindsay, can you say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I've been a spiritual director for about 12 or 13 years now. I have a quite specialized ministry in that I work with people who are uncomfortable with institutional religion or who have more than one faith affiliation, although of course I work with people with more traditional religious affiliations as well. I use that description of myself to invite people to bring their very honest questions and doubts to our work together, that even people who do not see themselves as being uncomfortable with institutional religion certainly have moments when they are, and so I try to create a very open place for the spiritual direction conversation. And because I work with people who aren't congregating in any one particular place, I reach out to them through my website and other untraditional means.
Right. No, exactly. And well, I think we'll talk a little bit more about those means in a few minutes. Um, but before we go on too much down the road talking with Lindsay here, we want to kind of make sure we touch upon the technical side of what we're going to talk about because I think we might have some people on the line who are new to some of the terms we use or have heard about them but aren't completely familiar with what they are. So before we talk too much about in the theory, um, I want to quickly introduce. Oh, push the wrong button there. Introduce many of you to a few two websites, two services that you may have not have seen before. The first one we're going to talk the most about today, I think, is Skype. Well, Skype's been around for quite a while now. It was originally kind of voice over internet. It was a way to make long distance phone calls cheap and easy. It's still often used for that, but Skype in the last few years has added a video function to it as well. So if you have a laptop with a webcam attached to it or built into the monitor, or if you have a desktop built into the monitor, like one of those all-in-ones, like an iMac or HP makes something like that, or if you have a webcam connected to your computer, you can video chat with folks across the country and across the world. I use Skype on a weekly basis to talk to my folks, let them see their grandkids, and as well as talk to my sister who lives in England. It's really exciting and really kind of neat, but it's also free for the most part. Skype will give you a username, and as long as you're using your username, you can talk to anyone else who has a Skype username account. Um, it's very easy to set up. All video chats are free. The one-to-one video chats are free. I think we'll talk a little bit later about group video chats. How um, in Skype you see a picture of that on the screen right here. Um, if you to have a group video chat, one person needs to have a premium account, such as Lindsay, and then they host this meeting, and multiple faces can show up on the screen. It's a really neat function, but ultimately, I don't think I can say it enough. It's free. It's free to sign up. So if you just create an account, you go to click Join Skype. It'll download software on your computer. It's pretty easy to use. The only time you have to pay for Skype besides this is if you wanted to make Skype a phone. You can make you can dial in to someone's actual telephone number through Skype as well, but you do have to pay. I think you have to buy credits for that. But if you're just using the account they give you, it's free. Another kind of name in video messaging um, now is Google. Google has just created its own Skype competitor, if you will, Google Plus, and they have these Google Plus Hangouts that you see right here. Google Plus Hangouts work very similar to Skype in the sense that you have more than one person chatting at a time. You can do a group chat. But unlike Skype, Google Hangouts are completely free. You don't need to have a premium account to host it. It can have, I think, up to 7 other guests, and it has a really neat function where it knows who's talking, and it makes the primary. That makes that the primary image for all the other speakers to see. Um, I'm going to be honest, I don't have much experience with Google Hangouts. Skype is very much the predominant source in video chat online right now. Um, but you can certainly try that out if you have a Google account or sign up for Google Plus, which I'm sure they'd love for you to do. So again, that's Skype and Google Plus. They're um, uh, over the air chat kind of units. Someone and Cheryl from our chat room says Google has up to 6 users, which is helpful. Thank you, Cheryl. So that's the Google Plus. That's the technical side. But most of us here are um, here for a little bit more kind of meat and potatoes, a little bit more conversation. So we're going to kind of jump back over to Lindsay for the next half hour, and then we'll get to some questions at the end. So you still there, Lindsay?
Yes, I'm here.
Great, awesome. So I met you. I had the chance to meet you taking a course this semester through the Center for Christian Spirituality. It was a group spiritual direction course, and we were introduced to you as someone who practices spiritual direction through social media, and like my ears perked up. Um, so I thought we can have a bit of a conversation online just for our guests today. But the one thing that's always kind of excited me the most about um, your story is kind of how reluctant you were um, to start using social media and technology in your practice.
Yes. Yes, for me, digital media have sometimes been a bit of a problem in my practice because I spend a lot of time in spiritual direction working with people, trying to help them to find more inner space in which to be present to God. And people are very, very busy in their lives, and then they take whatever small holes are left, and they often kind of fill up those holes with digital media, so that there's not very much time, there's not very much inner room to be with God. And they can feel when they come to me that that's an issue, but they're not always sure what to do about it. So I I feel that part of my job as a spiritual director is as a kind of a protector of inner space, and I'm always kind of helping people to restrict their use of digital media. So the idea that I would actually be using digital media to do spiritual direction was was pretty unnatural to me at first.
When we first talked, am I remembering correctly, you don't own a smartphone?
I don't own a smartphone. I'm not on Facebook. I don't really know how to text. Um, I am somewhat wired in that I have my website, but I like to have a very quiet atmosphere. I'm a contemplative. I spend an hour a day in contemplative prayer, so I'm very concerned with protecting my silence.
That's really important. I think one of the things we hear in our trainings when we kind of talk to people about using media is that time that it takes out of your life, and there's a lot of concern about the noise of social media, the noise of the internet.
I think that people can feel that there's something wrong in our culture, even if they're very, very wholehearted about their use of digital media. They can they can sense when they read about people who are texting when driving, or doctors surfing the web in the middle of surgery, or they see in their own lives that everybody is sitting at the dinner table staring at their phones. They know that something's wrong, and they're not quite sure what it is, or what to do about it. In my view, it has a lot to do with Sabbath. That in a lot of the Ten Commandments that are given to us are things that everybody knows, that they shouldn't kill, they shouldn't lie, they shouldn't commit adultery, but the Sabbath commandment has a tendency to get thrown out the window, or people think of it as a kind of an antiquated, eccentric habit that's only for very specialized groups like Orthodox Jews. But I think what we're feeling in our culture is a lack of Sabbath, and the difficulty that people have pulling themselves out of the kind of left brain flow of constant words and information and media use. We need some kind of Sabbath guidelines for helping us to break that flow. And so I think a very important question that we need to ask in spiritual direction is, what is Sabbath in the age of digital media, and how do we create guidelines that can give us our Sabbath back?
Yeah, I've often heard of the phrase kind of thrown around, input addiction.
Mm.
Does that kind of ring true for what you're kind of seeing in the people you kind of talk to?
It's something that I see in the people that I talk to, and it's something I see very much in any work that I do with people in meditation. I lead a weekly centering prayer group, and that's a form of Christian meditation that's somewhat similar to Zen meditation in that you let go of thoughts and you sit there silently returning again and again to a sacred word. So teaching people to do that is a way of helping them to break that flow. And when people engage in that practice, they can feel right away how deeply nourishing it is to be returned to that silence. But it's also really, really challenging.
I find when I'm without my smartphone for any given period of time is kind of an anxiety that kind of starts bubbling up that I kind of need to touch my pocket and it's not there, almost like my wallet's not there. I think.
Yes, well, it, I kind of stand outside of that as a spiritual director and watch it and people and help people on a one-to-one basis try to deal with that. But I think it would be very helpful if our societies started to develop more communal guidelines to help people to know how to deal with the challenges of smartphone addiction and Facebook addiction, because it's not easy to deal with these things on your own. And it's also, if we do make quiet time to be without those things, those times would be more meaningful if other people were engaging in them as well, and it wasn't such a solitary struggle.
Yeah. One thing that we've mentioned before on some kind of, particularly more of our in-person trainings, is this discussion on how um, there is an engagement, even online, but that even still, I think there's something to be said. Maybe you'd agree that even though we're still engaging on Facebook and we're still having personal interactions, that that Sabbath still calls for some time when we're not engaging, and it's not. I mean, we can't engage personally 24/7. That's not necessarily a good thing.
Yes, well, I think spiritual direction gives people a place to do discernment around that connection and look at it and think about how much of that connection is real and how much is an illusion. I'm quite suspicious of what I see people calling connection because of its compulsive or addictive quality. It makes me wonder, if it's so addictive, is it really meeting the needs that people think that it's meeting? To me, it seems like it's kind of like junk food. It isn't really nourishing, and so that's what makes you keep going back to it over and over again, because it's not really giving you something on a very deep level that's meeting your need.
Have you read much? And have you read much about any of these studies that keep popping up online about um, people who spend more time on Facebook actually have kind of greater sense of depression and kind of a lower sense of self-esteem and self-worth?
I do read those things. I'm also suspicious of my own excitement about articles like that, because I do have a kind of a prejudice, and I know that some people find those things more valuable than I do. Um, so I take those things with a grain of salt, but I think it would be a wonderful thing if our culture was offering alternatives, or kind of rules of the road for people. I don't know that much about the history of the automobile, but I imagine that after the car was invented, there was probably a moment where people were driving around crashing into each other because there weren't rules yet. And I think that that's kind of where we are in terms of our use of digital media. They've come into the world so very, very quickly, and we don't yet have communal guidelines for how to use them. And if we don't start putting those in place, then people are going to start crashing in various kinds of ways. They need help.
I had a chance to talk with Scott Gunn, one of the director now of the Forward Movement kind of publication, a publishing house who puts out the Forward day by day, and he said there's been a lot of concern and a lot of demand for um, some type of etiquette guide to social media. And I think that falls into it, that sense of both personal etiquette on when is it appropriate to use your phone and when is it appropriate to turn it off, but also kind of a social etiquette of what's okay to say on Facebook, what's okay not to put on Facebook, when do you overshare, and how do you properly engage? And I almost wonder if that information is going to come out of the current generation, the 17, 18-year-olds who are entering into college, who had this incredible gift of the internet thrown on their lap, and um, kind of they'll be the ones to kind of figure it out instead of us, who kind of have had some time with it and some time without it, and going to kind of figure, who are flailing in the dark trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
At least I hope so. Hopefully.
Yes, I hope so too. Yes, the issue you raise of oversharing is another particular concern of mine, because I think there are a couple of myths that cause people um, to see digital media as an unalloyed good. One is the myth that connection always has some kind of positive value, which we were talking about before. And the other is the myth that availability is always a positive value and that we should always be available to others. And I think that that's a very dangerous myth. The Sabbath, that our need for Sabbath time is one of the things that points to the ways in which we need more boundaries in our lives. And also in the Christian tradition, I think it's important to remind people that Jesus was not always available. He spent a huge amount of his time in the desert. 40 days of his ministry is a pretty significant chunk of his ministry. He was often going off to pray on his own, and he's often shown as actually running away from his followers. So I think it's important for people to look at the ways that boundaries help to protect us and protect the quiet time that we need to nourish ourselves spiritually and be in touch with God and be in the relationship that you mentioned earlier. If we're going to have time for our relationship with God, we're going to have to carve that time out of the time that's currently being given to other kinds of activities. And digital media are one of the first places where my directees tend to look when they start to think of, well, how can I make more time to be with God?
Mm.
One of the most dispensable things in their calendar when they look at them.
In that conversation that you're having with directees about kind of cutting out, looking for more time to spend with God, did you get kind of a sense of how much time people are spending, kind of a day, a week, or kind of what kind of draw that's taking away from their own silent time?
In terms of the digital media?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a kind of a hole plugger. I think it's hard for people to quantify because it's something that people turn to when there is a little space instead of just letting the space be there. To me, that's one of the definitions of prayer, that to find the little spaces in life and to just let them be there and to be with the feelings that come up in those spaces and the thoughts that come up in those spaces. I'm often urging people to make more time to just be in a kind of a dreamy state and let thoughts and feelings just kind of float up into their consciousness. And people sometimes look a little startled when I suggest that. I think they sometimes think that if they go to a spiritual director, she'll be telling them to pray on their knees or something more arduous. But I think that the quiet little moments in which our imaginations can roam around are one of the most important times that we have with God, because that's one of the ways that God can speak to us. So one of the things we look at is, where are people experiencing those kinds of moments of inspiration and closeness with God and just a sense of God's presence? Is it when they're sitting in nature? Is it when they're listening to music? Is it at the end of the day when they take a long bath and everybody else has gone to sleep? And we look at those moments and we talk about how nourishing they are, and then we try to find ways to protect them or make them a little bit longer so that they stretch out and become more of a person's day.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way of looking at how to cut down digital media, is to not so much look at the digital media, but to look at the things that are valuable and try to create a stronger presence for those things.
Yeah, funny, we talked about kind of cutting, you said it plugs holes. I was having a conversation with the priest this weekend, and he was talking about me about this little pocket Thomas Merton book he carries around with him all the time. And he said whenever he's standing in line, he likes to have something to kind of take out and read, and he reads these phrases of Thomas Merton. And I was completely shocked when he said this, because I realized, like, when I'm standing in line at the DMV or at the grocery store, I'm checking my Facebook. I was so I admired him for having something so much more fulfilling than kind of checking the latest feed in line. So it was just kind of it woke me up a little when he said it. I was like, oh man, I could do something else too.
Well, I think that there are also things that you can do to make your smartphone more of a sacred space. My sister recently got a smartphone for the first time, and she was quite anxious about what that might herald in her life, and so she was trying to find ways to restrict her email use, and I suggested Richard Rohr email of the day that she could subscribe to, and I think she was going to try and put art on her iPhone. So I think there are ways to make it more like a rosary or a sacred object that helps you to enter the sacred space, rather than taking you out of it. And there is an app, I can't remember the name of it right now, but several people have showed me an iPhone app that can be used to link you to a meditation community, and it gives you a place to record the amount of time you meditate each day, and it has several nice little chime sounds on it it has a timer that you can use to time your meditation, and so there are ways to change the atmosphere of your iPhone so that it becomes more of a help than a hindrance to the spiritual life. How much that really helps, I can't actually say from my own experience.
Uh, I quickly did a Google search for meditation community iPhone app. I don't think this is exactly what you're talking about, but I think you can see that it's just as easy as going on Google, and you can search meditation community iPhone app, and there is one. It looks like there's a timer and a prayer bowl online. So you can use your phone in that way. Um, I want to make sure we're able to talk about your practice itself, but before we go on, I want to make sure everyone listening knows that you can ask questions through this GoToWebinar software as well. When you signed in, the little panel showed up on your screen. There is a questions kind of tab, or there should be, hopefully, and you can click on that, and kind of a questions chat room almost kind of shows up, where you can enter in some questions, and we'll have some time at the end to share with them. One of the questions that came in from Alan, he recommends this book on um, Into the Silent Land, a guide to the practice of contemplation. Um, so it kind of seems like a good resource there. Thank you, Alan. So, other than kind of the theory, the reason we first kind of were introduced is that you do spiritual direction, but you also use Skype. In
Yes, I just very recently started using it in my practice. I started taking a telecourse on a meditative method called focusing, and I enjoyed the telecourse technology for that that course. There was no travel time required to go to the course. I could take it from anywhere, even when I was traveling. I enjoyed that I was in a class atmosphere, and yet I was at home by myself, so that if I was engaged in meditation, I felt very comfortable. I liked that it worked very well for this very structured form of meditation that I was studying. And then as part of the course, we were assigned homework in this meditation that we were doing with partners. And my partners suggested that we use Skype to meet because they were in other parts of the world. So it was an easy way for us to meet for free, and it was also nice because I had never met them before to see what they looked like. Sometimes we used the picture while we were doing the meditation, and sometimes we met and then just turned the picture off because we found it distracting. But I was very impressed by how it felt to be with these other people on Skype. We were doing this kind of meditation where we were spending a lot of time together in silence, but I felt their presence in a very powerful way, and it made me very curious about how Skype could be used for other kinds of contemplative activity. So I asked a friend of mine who also leads a centering prayer group if she would be interested in starting a centering prayer group on Skype with me for people who might be kind of isolated and might not have other people to do centering prayer with. And she said that she wasn't actually so interested in that, but she'd do that with me if I wanted. But what she was really interested in doing was group spiritual direction, which is something that I'd told her about, but something that she had never had a chance to experience. And she lives in a somewhat remote location where she doesn't know a lot of other contemplatives, and she was very excited about the idea of having a community of contemplatives online. So we invited a couple of other friends to join us, and we started a highly structured group spiritual direction group.
Lindsay? Lindsay, are you there?
Direction page.
Oh.
Colin?
Yep. Are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You're there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. I think we lost you for a second.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. You were talking about starting a highly structured kind of
Yes,
group.
we've been doing this group spiritual direction group for about 4 months now with 4 of us, and it's been very, very powerful. It's worked very well. We've done it without the picture and with the picture. I joined the service that you were talking about on Skype earlier, the premium service that allows you to have video conferencing with several people, and it's really a great way to bring together a community of contemplatives who may be somewhat isolated from other people in their communities, and allow them to support each other. So then I started experimenting with it in my individual spiritual direction practice, and I've found it very, very successful in as much as I've used it so far.
Lindsay, on a side note, I've realized that we go over some of the technology basics for some of the spiritual direction folks. Do you mind if we have some of the purely tech folks on the webinar, if you can kind of just briefly talk about the difference between individual and group spiritual direction? Because I know there are some kind of distinct features between the two.
Well, I'm not a real expert on group spiritual direction. Most of my practice is individual direction, which I've been doing in a very unstructured way, although the Skype spiritual direction is actually causing me to become a little bit more structured in my approach. The group spiritual direction model that I usually use, if I do it, is the Shalem method, where you intersperse timed periods of silence with timed periods of sharing. So I think what we do in our group is we sit in silence for 5 minutes, and then one person shares for about 15 minutes, and then the others respond very, very briefly. Then we sit in silence again for a couple of minutes, and then the next person shares until everyone has had a chance to speak, and then we sit in silence again at the very end. So it's a very, very structured format, but it seems to allow the spirit to emerge in a very powerful and surprising way. Everyone I know who's used that format has found it very successful and very powerful. So actually, one of the unexpected results of my using Skype for spiritual direction has been that it has encouraged me to go back to my individual direction practice and experiment a little bit more with that structure. Because one of the advantages of Skype is that because you don't have any travel time, you can make the meetings really any length you want. You know, if somebody's going to come all the way to my office in Brooklyn, then I usually feel like, of course, I need to give them an hour. But if we're meeting by Skype, then we can shorten the period for which we meet, which for me, as an introvert, is very, very helpful because I become quite tired after an hour. So what I've been trying in my individual spiritual direction, inspired by the group Skype sessions, is starting with 10 minutes of silence, which helps people to start from a really, really centered place when we start talking. Then we talk for 30 minutes, and then we stop and pray for a few minutes and schedule the next appointment. And that new format seems to work really, really well.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned when you were speaking to our class is you found that there was that you found the silence sometimes is more intentional over Skype.
Yeah, so I think there's something very surprising about
Yeah.
meeting over Skype in order to be silent. You know, that's not an ordinary thing to do, and I think it highlights that silence is not just an absence of noise. It's something valuable, and it's something nourishing. Often when I start working with people and we talk about different ways that they can introduce more silence or meditation into their lives, it maybe feels a little bit like an obligation to them, just one more thing that they ought to be doing. Oh gosh, how am I going to make time for that? But I think there's something about meeting together digitally in order to be silent that can emphasize the thingness of the silence. It starts to feel almost more like a thing that has something to offer. It contains nourishment and possibility, and then people start to feel how much they're really hungering for it. I think I was afraid when I first started asking my individual directees to sit for 10 minutes in silence before we began, that they might think that I was cheating them of 10 minutes of our valuable conversation, but I don't think that has ever been the case. They experience the silence as a gift, and they can feel how much they're getting out of it.
Did you find a resistance from your directees when you kind of first said like, "Hey, we're gonna try something completely new here. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna meet over Skype." How was that responded to?
Well, there are people who I've offered that invitation to who have refused, and it's hard for me to know why that is. You know, I think there are people who are uncomfortable with the technology. It's unfamiliar to them. It maybe feels invasive to them that you're kind of coming into their home. Actually, some people really enjoy that aspect of Skype, that you're coming into their home over great distances. There can be something very intimate about it. They can give you a little tour. They can show you around their home. They can show you the view out their window. But some people don't seem to want that. Some people don't want to be looked at, so they might be comfortable with the idea of the telephone, but not with Skype. I'm actually not comfortable doing spiritual direction over the telephone because I feel like I do not get a very strong intuitive connection with people over the telephone, and that it's very easy for the experience to devolve into a kind of a regular conversation that does not feel to me like the spiritual direction experience. But there's actually one thing I've experienced in the Skype spiritual direction is that the intuitive connection can actually be heightened in a way that I did not anticipate. If people have a zoom on their camera, which some people do, then I see their faces very, very large, which is actually quite helpful to me. When I'm doing spiritual direction and people are talking, I often I give part of my attention to what they're saying, but then I give a very large part of my attention to just how they are, how they feel to me physically. And there's often a kind of a dissonance between those two things, that what they're saying is important to them, but it's often a kind of a story that they're telling about themselves that's a kind of an idea, and how they are is a little bit different. And so I try to, part of the way that I pray for them is I try to kind of rest or live in that dissonant place between the two things, the story that they're telling and the way they are physically and the way they feel to me. And in Skype, there can be a little bit of a delay in between the picture and the sound, and there's also an issue in that you are not making eye contact with them usually in the normal way, because one person's looking at their screen and the other person's looking at their screen, and neither of them are usually looking directly into the camera, and so the eyes are often not meeting in the usual way. So some people find those things quite distracting. I sometimes find them distracting, but they actually can be quite helpful to me, because as part of my intuitive work with people, in a way I'm kind of deconstructing what is happening in a regular conversation anyway, so that the way that Skype does that can actually be unexpectedly helpful to me.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, I guess, a surprising benefit of having that screen. I wanted to ask if you ever have any kind of request to turn the video off, but then I assume that's just like a phone conversation. So it seems to me that having that camera on is a integral part of the experience, even when there's just kind of silence and meditation going on.
Well, I think it is nice to have the option of turning the picture off. I haven't actually done that in individual direction, but I have done the group spiritual direction without the image, and I think there are advantages to both. I think there might be advantages in teaching with having the picture off. I really liked the teleconference I was taking on the focusing meditation, because I think there's a way in which, when you're working with a teacher, particularly in a spiritual setting where you might see the teacher as a kind of a more advanced spiritual being or something, that there can be a tendency to to project a lot onto the teacher and maybe idealize them. And so I think not being able to see a teacher in certain situations can actually be quite helpful and might help people to take in the teaching in a more direct way without worrying quite so much about the teacher and who the teacher is and what the teacher is like.
So I want to get to some of the questions that are coming up in the kind of the chat panel because they all are kind of rolling into where we're talking about anyway. Um, and Chris has a question about uh, starting up relationships with clients. And have you had any new directees that have started that you've only gotten to know via Skype, or have they all started through a personal interaction and then led into the digital meeting?
That's a very good question. Yes, at this point I have not had any new directees, and so I am very curious about that because the people that I've met with in individual Skype there's already a certain level of intimacy that can be built on from the personal connection. I might not have met with them in direction before, but I've met with them in some way. Although actually, no, that's not quite true. In the group spiritual direction, there was one person that I had not met, and I didn't find that meeting with Skype with that person was any kind of obstacle to becoming more intimate with them in the direction process. You know, it took a little bit longer than with the other people in the group that I did know, but I don't think it needs to be a problem.
Yeah, that's really great. Apparently, Chris mentioned that there's some spiritual directors who will only use Skype after face-to-face bonds, but it's
Hmm.
interesting that it seems to me that that relationship is going to kind of bloom, whether it starts in person or digitally, which I think is a good segue to a question we have from Cheryl. Is do you ever see any kind of resistance from people, or people kind of push back on you that say digital applications are a barrier and that kind of only face to face conversations are real? How are you are you able to respond to them, or if you haven't had that, could you respond to that?
Well, in most of the situations where I've been using the Skype for spiritual direction, I haven't been getting pushback because the other option is not having a spiritual director at all. You know, people are not comparing what we're doing to a in-person direction because they're geographically isolated and they can't find a spiritual director, or the only spiritual director who's available to them is someone with whom they have some kind of a boundary issue, as is often the case because people who want a spiritual director are often known to the only people in their community who would make a good spiritual director through some kind of work connection. And also, since I specialize in working with people who are often quite alienated from traditional religion, they're quite unlikely to have even had a spiritual director in the past. So, you know, it's often me or nothing.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point, I think. Um,
I
uh,
think Skype is going to become more popular for spiritual direction simply because for a lot of people out there it's going to be the only option.
in terms of finding a spiritual director, you mean like
In terms of
geographically?
finding a spiritual director with whom they don't have any boundary issues.
Oh, that's true because you the distance aspect of Skype does remove kind of some of those boundary concerns that do arise in finding a spiritual director in your parish or in a community that you already are involved in.
Yes, one of the things I've been thinking very seriously about developing is a kind of a network for contemplatives where they can be in support and supervision groups via Skype, because often the only people who are geographically close to contemplatives with whom they could do that are people with whom they have boundary issues, but they really, really need support and supervision. So I think Skype would be a really, really great place for them to be doing that kind of work.
Yeah, certainly. We actually have a question from Mother Jean Persons, who is the director of the Center for Christian Spirituality at General. I know she's actually over in Manhattan at the moment on campus with a group of other spiritual directors and students and peers of hers who are all gathered under one name. Either she or they have a question. If you could talk a little bit more about the structure of sharing and conversation in your digital sessions.
Yes, well, as I say, I'm moving into a much more structured format than I had before. I was taught in spiritual direction school to have 1 hour sessions, and they were basically pretty unstructured. We've always started with a little bit of silence, but I've kind of left it up to the directee how long that silence will be. Some people will sit there for 5 or even 10 minutes in silence, but most will just take a few seconds. And then we've stopped in a spontaneous way for prayer in the center of sessions, sometimes for silence, sometimes for some kind of exercise, and some directees like to always close with prayer. I don't always do that because of the people I'm working with are not always comfortable with verbal prayer, so I haven't made that a requisite for my work. But it's been pretty unstructured, but I really like the structure of the Shalem method of group spiritual direction, so that's been one inspiration to me. And another inspiration to me has been I work on a long silent retreat as a spiritual director, and on that retreat I see people for periods of 10 to 15 minutes, and all in a row. I'll see like 6 or 8 people for 10 minutes at a time, and that is a really unusual and interesting experience because if people come in and they know that's the only time they're going to have with you, and they just sit down and they get right to it. In regular spiritual direction, it can be like therapy. It could take months for people to finally be able to articulate the thing that's really troubling them, or to start to trust you. But in these little short sessions, people come in, they sit down, they start crying, they start telling you what is most important to them, and within 10 minutes you've become incredibly intimate. So I've learned from that experience that there's nothing scientific about the 1 hour. People will use the time they have to do what they need to do. So that has given me those two things, the Shalem group spiritual direction method and that experience on retreat, have given me the confidence to start structuring the Skype sessions a little bit more. And I think the structure is maybe helpful to the Skype experience. That's just my intuitive sense of it. But there's also something quite purposeful about the Skype spiritual direction, because if you have someone come into your home, they're taking off their coat and you're talking to them about the weather outside, and there's more chit chat at the beginning and at the end. And with the Skype experience, it can be a lot more focused, and I think there's something helpful about that. Again, that's my intuitive sense, but I think that there's some way in which the spirit is really, it's almost, I don't want to say harness, because you never harness the Holy Spirit, but it's somehow focused by that structure.
Yeah. So we're coming up on the 2 o'clock hour, and before you leave, I know we have a lot of spiritual directors on the call and they might be interested in some of the stuff that you've mentioned today. Do you have any kind of tips or tricks or ideas or pitfalls that you've run into that you'd warn against, or anything that you'd want to tell any spiritual directors who are considering getting into this sort of digital spiritual direction?
Um, well, I'll say that it's good to have a backup plan because Skype can be adversely affected by the weather. If you're in a place with low bandwidth, there are a number of circumstances that can make it not work very well. So it's good to have a backup plan. With group meetings, I've set up an account on freeconferencecall.com that can be used as a conference call thing. So that's one option. I'm not sure I'd be too comfortable going to the telephone backup with a individual directee. So I might want to have like a backup time or something if somebody was calling from a place where they had a lot of problems. It's helpful to not be on too tight a schedule because there can be a little bit of trouble getting on and off. So on mostly, not off. So it's good to have like an extra 10 minutes built into your schedule for if the call doesn't go through properly the first time, especially if you're doing a Skype conference call. To get everybody on may take a few tries. I'd also say that I have tried centering prayer over Skype, which was one of the things I was initially most excited about, and that has not really worked very well. The Skype aggregates all the noise from everybody's location because of the speakers and the computers, so you end up with everybody's noise all at once, and so most people do not find that a really comfortable atmosphere for centering prayer. It seems to be fine for just the 10 minutes of silence, but if pure silence is the main event, then Skype might not be the right thing.
No, I think that's a good point. Um, so I know one thing that we wanted to do, we wanted to close our webinar today with a minute of silence. So, um, and I think you were going to lead us in a chant. So I think that would be a nice way to end. So before we do that, let me just quickly um, just thank you very much for joining us today. I think this was an incredible experience. It's for me, and hopefully as well as for everyone else, to kind of have this conversation. I think if there's anyone on the line who has been with us for our other webinars, I think the tone of this is very different. I think we're often talking about what other ways you can kind of fit social media into your ministry. This is kind of the opposite. This is almost, which I think is good to have that other side of the coin. But always, if you're getting into social media and kind of your ministry, um, or your church or yourself, check to see, understand you or your church's identity. Um, all of these aren't necessarily appropriate or helpful for all communities or all people. So it's helpful if you know yourself first. If you're in a church or in a peer group, think about starting a committee about these kind of things to explore them further. For us, I typically here I plug future webinars, but I think we're going on hiatus. We'll have more when the programming year picks up again in September. But you can get those at digitalformation.eventbrite.com. Always on Tuesday nights on Twitter, if you have the hour, you can search the hashtag at CHCO, CHSOCM on Twitter. That's the Church and Social Media Chat. Um, Always Google if you have any questions regarding these things. Google is a great resource. If you have any other questions, always feel free to email us at digitalformation@gts.edu. A lot of the links that we've talked about here today, I put up on our Facebook page, facebook.com/digitalformation. If you haven't liked us already, please do that to keep up to date with what we're talking about. And then finally, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/digiformation. So, Lindsay, I turn the floor back over to you.
Thanks so much, Colin. I loved being here. We're just going to end with a minute of intentional silence together, and then I'll chant Psalm 93 in Stephen Mitchell's translation. God acts within every moment and creates the world with each breath. God speaks from the center of the universe in the silence beyond all thought, mightier than the crash of a thunderstorm, mightier than the roar of the sea, is God's voice silently speaking in the depths of the listening heart.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for joining us.